Kili Olam Hasdo, Hoidul Hashem Kitov, Kili Olam Hasdo. Give thanks to God for He is good. His kindness is forever. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Thank You Hashem by Joey Newcomb, featuring our own Moshe Storch. Let's light up the darkness. Who's gonna be with us as we do a little learning, a little beautiful learning, and meet the Mensch? We're gonna meet one of the early Tanaim, the early rabbis of the Mishna. Beautiful story about him, Akavya ben Mahalalel. Who is with us tonight? Carol in Cleveland, Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, James in Indianapolis. Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in Dover, Harold says hi, Sal and Nina, Judith in Ormond Beach, Renee in Indy, and live at last. Welcome, Renee. Isabel Delgado Estrella dice hola, hola. Arnold Alban says gladly in the house from Northridge, California. Allison St. Clair from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Renee missed being live with us, and so glad to have you here, Renee. Chaim in Charlotte, Steve in Tallahassee, Samantha in Tacoma. Over there on the YouTube side, we got Marjorie saying shalom from Georgia, and Lynn, shalom from North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, let me just move my microphone back a little. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Yitzi Tuval, our good friend Yitzi Tuval, for the healing, the refuah shlema, the complete healing of Yehuda David ben Vered. May we only hear good news about Yehuda David ben Vered. May he have a complete and speedy recovery, and we say amen. And Yitzi, thank you for sponsoring tonight's learning. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings from Shemayim, from heaven, and we say amen. We are holding, this is Daf Samech Daled, that's page 64, here in Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're in the second half of Tractate Pesachim, so we've been studying Mishnahs pertaining to the actual Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, the offering that was brought in Jerusalem on Passover when the temple was standing. Tonight we're in chapter 5, and we'll be discussing the fifth Mishnah. The Mishnah itself is actually quite lengthy. Usually the Mishnahs are very short, and then it's the Gemara, the commentary, the first level of commentary by the later rabbis, the Amoraim. And Amora is a rabbi of the Talmudic period, also known as the Gemara. The Gemara is that first commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was the first setting down of the oral law. The rabbis mentioned in the Mishnah are known as Tanaim. So we'll be discussing one of those. Tanaim is plural of Tanna, and we'll be discussing a very early Tanna, Akavya ben Mahalalel, momentarily. Let's get into this Mishnah, the fifth Mishnah in chapter 5 here in Tractate Pesachim. The Paschal lamb was slaughtered in 3 groups. So this Mishnah, what's great about it is we can really start to paint that picture, right? What was it like? Not everybody made it up to Jerusalem to partake in the Paschal lamb, the Paschal offering. People would have a Seder. They would celebrate Passover elsewhere if they couldn't get to Jerusalem. But it was only in Jerusalem where they could bring the Paschal offering, where they could bring the Paschal lamb, either a lamb or a lamb of the goats, a kid of the goats. And then there would be a group, as we've discussed, registered for each sacrifice, for each lamb or kid. And then that night they would eat it roasted. They would tell over the story of the Exodus from Egypt, etc. But to actually partake in the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, they had to be in Jerusalem when the temple was standing. Today's Mishnah really starts to paint that picture, what it was like. The Paschal lamb was slaughtered in 3 groups, meaning those bringing the offering were divided into 3 separate sets, as it is stated, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. We saw that law yesterday. That's Exodus 12:6. Meaning in the afternoon on the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, the 15th begins that night, and that's when Passover begins. So they slaughter the Korban Pesach that afternoon. The verse is interpreted as referring to 3 groups, right? The verse said, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. And from this, our sages learned out that they would do so in 3 groups. The procedure for sacrificing the offering was as follows. The first group of people sacrificing the offering entered. And when the temple courtyard became filled with them, they closed the doors of the temple courtyard. Now, who is filling up the temple courtyard? It's the one person of each group, right? Groups of people would register to share one lamb or one kid. I mean, how many people can share in one lamb? I don't know. I mean, a lamb is pretty big. Maybe there's 10 people, 20 people, 30 people can, as long as they get like a very small piece, they don't need such a huge piece of it. So it really could be a lot of people, but only one of them is going to bring the lamb into the courtyard of the temple where it will be slaughtered, and its blood will be sprinkled on the altar, and then it will be ready to be taken out. It'll have to be flayed, its skin taken off, and then it'll be roasted and eaten that night. So the temple is crowded simply with each representative of the groups who are going to have their Passover Seder together. Just one person is bringing the offering into the courtyard. And so this one representative of their various groups, each would bring the lamb, and the courtyard was filled with the one person per group who was bringing a lamb. There were many lambs brought by this one representative of each group. They sounded uninterrupted, broken, and uninterrupted trumpet blasts, right? So just like when we blow the shofar by Rosh Hashanah, and we have a tekiah, and then a teruah, and a tekiah, that's what they're talking about here. They did it as a trumpet blast, but a long blast, and then a broken blast, or perhaps da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then a long blast, da, right? And they would do that. And those blasts, the long, the broken, and then the long blast, was done while they were sacrificing the offerings, right? So remember that each offering has 4 rites that are associated with it. There's the shechting, the slaughtering. Then that can be done by any Jew. It doesn't have to be a priest. But when they slaughter it, the blood has to be received in a vessel, and that does have to be done by a priest. And then the blood has to be carried to the altar. That has to be done by a priest. And then some of that blood needs to be sprinkled on the altar in the temple. And that had to be done by a priest. And all of it had to be done correctly, or the sacrifice would become unfit. Now, the priests stood in rows from the place of slaughter to the altar. And in their hands they held bowls, bezichen, of silver and bowls of gold, in order to receive the blood of the offerings. Now, I'll show this picture. When we hear bowl, we have this picture in our minds of like a salad bowl, like they're holding a salad bowl there, and they're going to pass the bowl from one priest to the other. But it was really much more like a ladle, right? So that these bowls were small, and they each had a handle. So that's what they would receive the blood in. And why was the handle important? Because they were passing the bowls along from one priest to the next, as we'll read. But what they couldn't do is put the bowl down. It would fall over. Why? So that none of these bowls would have a chance to become like abandoned. Like some priest might put it down for a moment and forget, and then the offering would become disqualified since the blood wasn't taken expeditiously to be sprinkled on the altar. So there was a row entirely composed of priests holding silver bowls and a row entirely composed of priests holding gold bowls, as the gold and silver bowls were not mixed in the same row. The bowls did not have flat bases that would allow them to be put down out of concern that perhaps the priest would set them down and forget about them, and in the meantime the blood would congeal and become disqualified for sprinkling on the altar. So here's a little, if you can see this illustration of what those bowls might have looked like, right there, with a handle and a cup to do the receiving. An Israelite, right, meaning not a priest, not a Levite, could be, later it's discussed, could it be a priest or a Levite? Yes, it could be, but it didn't have to be. So an Israelite could certainly bring the lamb or the kid of the goats. An Israelite would slaughter the sacrifice, and the priest would receive the blood and immediately hand it to another priest standing next to him, and the other priest would pass it to another. Each priest would receive a full bowl of blood from the priest next to him and return to him an empty bowl being passed in the opposite direction, the contents of which had already been sprinkled on the altar. The priest who was closest to the altar would sprinkle a single sprinkling of blood against the base of the altar, against the north and west sides of the altar where there was a base. Right, so when I was reading this earlier, I was thinking, how could, you're passing along a bowl that has liquid and it has the blood of the sacrifices in it and receive an empty bowl, like how can you pass a full bowl and receive an empty bowl? Don't you need two hands for each bowl? And that's when I saw, they have handles, right? So you pass the full bowl on down this row of priests, right? They pass it. It's like a bucket brigade. It's going to get there faster over to the altar than if somebody's just running down. So you pass the full, receive the empty. Pass the full, receive the empty. And you always pass the full first before receiving the empty, because the full bowl that's being passed down the line of priests so they could do the sprinkling on the altar, that's fulfilling an obligation, doing a mitzvah. The receiving the empty one back so that it could be done again, that's enabling a mitzvah, but it's not actually doing the mitzvah. So you always pass the full first before receiving the empty. The first group, now there were three groups, right? All of these people who were bringing the lambs or kids to be slaughtered in the temple and their blood sprinkled on the altar, all of them were divided into three groups, and they were labeled assembly, congregation, and Israel, but they were just generally speaking three large groups. The first group exited upon completion of the rite, and the second group entered. The second group left upon completion of its rite, and the third group entered. As it was done by the first group, so it was done by the second and third groups. All people standing in the temple courtyard while the Paschal lambs were being slaughtered would recite Hallel, right? So we recite Hallel. I've done this for you. We recite Hallel at Rosh Chodesh, right? When there's a new month. We also do it on holidays. Often when it's a holiday, we're reciting Hallel, but we can't broadcast video during Yom Tov, during a holiday, because it's like Shabbos. No work is permitted. But on Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of each month, work is permitted and we recite Hallel. So that's when I've been sharing it. So here they're reciting Hallel. Who leads them in reciting Hallel? The Leviim, the Levites, right? The Levites are the assistants of the priests, as it were, and they were responsible for the music in the temple. They played harps, they played trumpets, they played other instruments. They had a choir that was singing, and they would lead all these visitors to the temple in reciting the Hallel as the lambs were being slaughtered. If they finished reciting the Hallel before all the offerings were slaughtered in that particular group, they recited it a second time. And if they finished reciting it a second time, before the slaughtering was done, they recited it a third time as the priests, and they never, although in practice, they never recited it a third time as the priests worked efficiently and finished the rite before this became necessary. Rabbi Yehuda says the third group never reached even once the opening verse of the 4th chapter of Hallel. I love that the Lord bears the voice of my supplications. That's Psalms 116, right? Hallel is basically Psalms 113 through 118. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying that the third group, they never even got through Hallel once because there was the first two groups that were large. The third group was just like the people that didn't fit in the first two groups, but it was always small, and they could certainly slaughter all their lambs even before they recited Hallel once. Because its people were few and the slaughtering of the offerings were completed during the recitation of the first 3 chapters of Hallel. As it was done during the week, so was it done on Shabbos. Only that on Shabbos, the priests would rinse the temple courtyard, cleaning away the blood, contrary to the wishes of the sages, as the priests did not want to veer from the weekday procedure in this regard. Rabbi Yehuda says, before the floor was rinsed, a priest would fill a cup with blood of the many offerings brought that day that was now mixed together on the floor, and then sprinkle it with a single sprinkling upon the altar. But the rabbis did not agree with Rabbi Yehuda with regard to this point. Now, what's interesting about this is the halacha is mentioned right here, and it says the procedure for offering the Paschal lamb on Passover Eve that occurred on Shabbos was the same as the procedure on a weekday, and the priests would even rinse the floor. The claim that this was done contrary to the wishes of the sages is a minority view. Okay, it's included in the Mishna, but actually the sages did not disapprove of that. How would one suspend and flay the Paschal lamb in the temple? Flay meaning you're going to take off the woolly, skin, the outer skin, because then it's going to be roasted whole, but you don't roast it with its wool on it, right? So you would take off that skin in order to prepare it for roasting, and they would do that right in the same place where the slaughtering was done. How? The Paschal, how is it done? Iron hooks were secured into the walls and pillars, and upon them one would suspend the offering and pull off its skin. If anyone lacked a place among the hooks in the temple courtyard to suspend and flay the offering, there were thin, smooth rods there, which he could place on his own shoulder and on another's shoulder, and from it they would suspend the offering and flay it. So people would work together. There were some rods there. You could put them between two people's shoulders, hang up the lamb. A third person would work with them, maybe pull off the skin, and then, switch places and get the lambs ready for roasting. I mean, it's kind of gross for us. We're not really accustomed to this, but if you're a chef, this is standard operating procedure, right? And truthfully, you've probably heard me say this before if you've been with me for a while. It's kind of a shame that all of us live in a time where, if you don't eat meat, good. You have your reasons for not eating meat, whether it's health or principle, etc. If you do eat meat, I eat meat. I love meat. But the fact is, I think it's a shame that all of us who eat meat really think of meat as just cubes of something that comes in styrofoam boxes from the supermarket. And we really have lost touch with the idea that what we're eating is a precious gift that God has given to us, that we're, that these animals that are good for eating, they're very tasty for us. They give up their life so that we can eat them. And because we've lost touch with the fact that they are animals and they have to be slaughtered and flayed and roasted, etc., we lose touch with what an animal really is when we're eating it, and that's a shame. So I've been talking about this for years, but someday, perhaps when COVID is over, we'll get a group of people together and we'll have a kosher butcher, and we'll have a farmer, and we'll get a live, lamb or something, and we'll appreciate that animal is giving up its life for us, and we'll witness the entire procedure so that we can really marvel and be thankful for what it is we're receiving. Moving on. Rabbi Eliezer says, when the 14th of Nisan occurred on Shabbos, when moving the rods is prohibited, he would rest his hand on another's shoulder and the other's hand on his own shoulder and suspend the offering and flay it, right? So they couldn't put those rods between two shoulders because of Shabbos, so they would just extend their arms as a place to hang the lamb so that they could pull off the skin prior to cooking it. And so he would tear open the flesh of the offering and remove its sacrificial parts, so that there were parts of the lamb which did not get roasted for eating, the fats and other parts that were offered on the altar. And he would place the sacrificial parts in a large basin, and then they would be burned on the altar in the temple. If this took place on Shabbos, when carrying is prohibited, the first group would exit and they would remain on the Temple Mount. And the second group would remain within the rampart, which was an area outside the women's courtyard of the temple. And the third group would stand in its place in the temple. Why, right? Why didn't they just take the animal and get going? Because it was happening on Shabbos, right? So they couldn't start cooking until Shabbos ended, right? When Passover falls on Saturday night, right? When it begins Saturday night, they still slaughter the Paschal offerings in the afternoon of Erev Pesach, meaning when the 14th is on Saturday, the 14th of Nisan, they still slaughter the animals that afternoon during Shabbos. Normally, it's absolutely prohibited to slaughter an animal on Shabbos, but the law in the Torah overrides, right? So we slaughter the Paschal offering even on Shabbos, but we don't cook on Shabbos. So they would wait until nightfall to begin cooking. And so they would just wait there until Shabbos ended, and then they would quickly take the slaughtered and flayed lambs and get them onto the fire that was already ready to go, right? Before Shabbos, I guess they would make the fire piles and then light them as soon as Shabbos ended, and then get the animals roasting. Yes, and that's the point. And then they would wait there until nightfall, and as soon as it became dark, they would all go out and roast their Paschal lambs, everyone in his own place, wherever they were situated around the city of Jerusalem. All right. Now we move down a little ways, and we're going to do a short discussion in the Gemara about this Mishnah that we've just read, this Mishnah that really paints a picture of what it was like to be in Jerusalem on Passover when the temple was standing, and then that is going to carry us into our discussion. Today's show is called Meet the Mensch, and you'll see why we're going to meet this early Tanna Akavya. So the Mishnah teaches that the first group entered, after which they closed the doors to the temple courtyard. It was stated that the Amoraim, right, so the rabbis of the Gemara, the later rabbis, meaning the rabbis who were learning and teaching between about the year 200 and the year 500 of the Common Era, that it was stated that the Amoraim disagreed about the precise wording of the Mishnah. Abaye said, "We learned in the Mishnah that the doors of the temple courtyard closed by themselves," meaning miraculously closed by themselves. Rava said, "We learned in the Mishnah that the people would close the doors of the temple courtyard at the appropriate time." How odd, right? So are we actually saying that, well, when enough people were in the courtyard, they would close the doors? That's what it sounds like. That sounds simple. That's the simple meaning. That would be Rava. But Abaye says, no. The doors closed, meaning they miraculously closed. And we have a tradition that there were miracles, there were continuous miracles in the temple. Certainly during the first temple, there were many continuous miracles. They never had to light the fire on the altar, right? That was a miracle from God. God would light the fire of the altar every day. And there were about 10 other miracles that we won't list today. But one of these miracles was that when enough people came into the courtyard on Passover, then the doors of the courtyard would shut themselves miraculously. I mean, there were so many miracles going on. This really was that axis mundi. This was that portal, right, between where heaven and earth meet. That's what was understood that the Holy Temple was in Jerusalem. So what is the practical difference between them? Well, it's a pretty strong difference. Abaye says the doors closed miraculously. Rava says the people closed the doors. But what does the Gemara say? The practical difference between them is with regard to whether we rely on a miracle. Abaye said, we learn in the Mishnah that the doors closed by themselves. As many people as entered, entered, and we rely on a miracle to close the doors so that an excessive number of people do not enter and thus create a danger. Rava said we learned in the Mishna that people would close the doors, and we do not rely on a miracle to ensure that the courtyard not become overly crowded. Now, this question of relying on a miracle, right? So we have a note here from Rav Steinsaltz. Relying on a miracle. Although in principle, one must not rely on a miracle, right? This is a very typical saying in the Talmud. Do not rely on a miracle. Generally, what that means is don't put yourself in a place of danger where the only way that you're going to get out of that situation intact is like, oh my God, it was a miracle, right? In other words, don't go crossing 6 lanes of freeway expecting that the cars will all swerve and stop and get out of your way so that you will miraculously cross that highway without getting killed. Do not rely on a miracle. Take care of yourself. Conduct yourself like a sensible, rational, God-fearing and danger-fearing person. But, so although in principle we must not rely on a miracle, since miracles were a common occurrence in the temple, as mentioned in Tractate Avot, and we're going to be looking at a line from Tractate Avos, it was permitted there to rely on miracles ab initio, right? In the rest of the world, we don't rely on a miracle. But since there were continuous miracles happening in the temple, so there you could rely on a miracle, right? And not only did those doors close by themselves, but there's also an understanding here that the size of the courtyard would actually miraculously increase if there were huge numbers of people, as we'll discuss in a moment. So Rashi explains that the doors were closed in order to ensure that not everyone enter at once, so that there would be a third group. Some suggest that according to this, they relied on a miracle here, because even if a miracle would not be performed and there would not be a third group, the Paschal lamb would still be valid. Okay, so on this question of whether we rely on a miracle or not and how many people were entering the courtyard at one time, so now we get this quick digression. And that which we learned elsewhere in a Mishna with regard to the ban placed upon Akavya ben Mahalalel for having spoken harshly about Shemaiah and Avtalion. Shemaiah and Avtalion were the pair of sages in the previous generation from Hillel and Shammai. So these were very early sages. They were a great pair. They're recorded in Pirkei Avos, the chapters of the fathers. And Akavya ben Mahalalel was a contemporary of theirs. And at some point, there's a controversy about whether he spoke inappropriately about his elders, about his teachers, right? And so there's some dispute about whether or not Akavya actually spoke inappropriately about his teachers. And because he spoke inappropriately, the sages of his generation placed a ban on him. We're going to be learning about that in a moment. But with regard to Akavya ben Mahalalel, Rabbi Yehuda said, heaven forbid that Akavya ben Mahalalel was banned. You may have heard that he was banned, but it's an impossibility that he was banned. Why? It must have been someone else, as even when the entire Jewish people would come to Jerusalem for the festival, the temple courtyard would not close on any man from Israel as full of wisdom and fear of sin as Akavya ben Mahalalel. Abaye can explain this statement according to his opinion, and Rava can also explain it according to his opinion. Abaye can explain it according to his opinion as follows. No man from Israel was in the temple courtyard when it closed by itself, thanks to a miracle, who was as full of wisdom and fear of sin as Akavya ben Mahalalel. And Rava too can explain it according to his opinion as follows. No man from Israel was in the temple courtyard when people closed the doors, who was as full of wisdom and fear of sin as Akavya ben Mahalalel. So really, we're not learning anything about whether the doors were closed miraculously or by other people. It's that the idea was that all of Israel was at the temple on Passover, right? Basically, it was like the whole nation came up to Jerusalem. And when the whole nation was up to Jerusalem, and I guess technically they would be divided into 3 groups, but even so, a third of the whole nation, would be in that courtyard at once. And there was no man in that courtyard who was as full of wisdom and fear of sin as Akavya ben Mahalalel, says Rabbi Yehuda. So how could such a man be placed under a ban? Let's learn about Akavya ben Mahalalel. It's not an easy name to say. Akavya ben Mahalalel. All right. Let me get my handy. Oi! Sorry. I got my nice stender here. But I'm going to a volume of the art scroll, which is bigger and heavier than the Koran. Okay, so this is, I've recommended this before. It's wonderful. This is the introduction to the Talmud, put out by Art Scroll, the introduction to their Talmud Bavli. All right, and here we have a section on Talmudic personalities, and this is on Akavya ben Mahalalel. So Akavya ben Mahalalel lived during the time of the Second Temple. He was in the same generation as Shemaiah and Avtalion, the teachers of Hillel and Shammai. From the Gemara, it seems that Akavya outlived both Shemaiah and Avtalion. You can see that at Brachos 19a. He was considered one of the greatest sages of the early Tanaic period, and his opinions are quoted several times in the Mishna. The Mishna describes his greatness in glowing terms. And that quotes what we said right here. No person found in the temple courtyard while the Pesach offering was being slaughtered, in other words, when most Jews were in the temple, was his equal in Torah knowledge or fear of sin. So that's given right here in Tractate Pesachim on page 64. And it's also going to be shared again in the Mishnah at Eduyos 5:6. The magnitude of his stature is further indicated by the lack of any honorific titles such as rabbi or rabban. This is in keeping with the saying, greater than those called rabban, right? Like Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, etc., Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, even greater than them, and those were the heavyweights, the big VIPs among the sages, but even greater than them are the ones who have no honorific, like Hillel and Shammai. They weren't called Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai. Hillel, Shammai, and now Akavya ben Mahalalel is at that level. How do we know that that's so great? Because they're referred to by their first names in the same way that Jeremiah and Isaiah and Micah and Zechariah and prophets were referred to. Akavya was a man of very great integrity. The Mishnah tells us that he testified in the name of the earlier sages about 4 matters of law that were disputed by the other sages of his time. Now, this is the incident that led to this idea that was he banned or was he not, right? Rabbi Yehuda said it's impossible that he was banned, but there was a dispute that he was involved in, and this is what it was. The sages said to him, so he had, on 4 matters, he disagreed with all the sages who were his contemporaries on these 4 matters. And the sages said to him, Akavya, reverse your opinion about these 4 matters and accept the rulings of the majority, and we will appoint you the Av Beis Din, the head of the court of the Jewish people. The Av Beis Din is second only to the Nasi, like the chief rabbi of all the people, the chief spiritual authority is the Nasi, and the second in command is the Av Beis Din. Akavya replied to them, it is preferable for me to be called a fool all the days of my life and not become a wicked person for even one moment before God by rejecting the tradition I received from the previous generation. And even if I did reverse my opinion, I would not accept the position of Av Beis Din, so that people would not say that Akavya reversed his opinions for the sake of obtaining a position of authority, right? So his integrity was great. He had heard it from his teachers. He knew what he heard. They told him to reverse his opinion so that he would on those matters be consistent with the majority view. And he said no. And even when they said, listen, we're going to make you the top banana. I mean, like just second only to the Nazis, a position of tremendous importance and respect and prominence. He said, no, it's not for me. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to obtain that position by changing my views on things I know I heard from my teachers. Akavya is the author of the following timeless and cherished teaching. Now, this is from Pirkei Avos. And this teaching of Akavya ben Mahalalel is so important. Even what is Pirkei Avos, right? The chapters of the fathers. And we shared many times. That's where you'll find something like who is rich, one who is content with what he has, who is strong, one who masters his impulse, where there is no man, be the man, etc. Many, many famous sayings. It's like Jewish wisdom's greatest hits. And even among the greatest hits of Jewish wisdom, Akavya ben Mahalalel occupies a position of special importance. This teaching that I'm going to share with you is Pirkei Avos 3:1. It merited to open one of the 5 or 6 chapters, depending on how it's published, of chapters of the Fathers. It's considered very important, right? This is one of those teachings that you really need to wrestle with and make your own. What did he say? Pay attention to 3 things, and you will not come to sin. Know where you came from, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give judgment and accounting someday. Know where you came from, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give an accounting in the future. Now I'm going to read what, he's going to continue. And this is one of those teachings that when you first hear it sounds like, oh man, that is old-fashioned and heavy. And, we're so much more modern, and we're not going to, be made to feel guilty and small by these kinds of old-fashioned teachings. And that is an arrogant attitude. And this teaching is about arrogance, as we'll explain in a minute. So this is the way Akavya ben Mahalalel said it. Pay attention to 3 things. Where you are going, where you came from, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give judgment and accounting someday. Where do you come from? From a foul drop of liquid, right? Meaning you come from the sperm and the egg that came together. You were nothing. You were just like a little cell. You were nothing. And where are you going? To a place of dirt, maggots, and worms. No matter how great you are in this world, no human has ever escaped death. Right? Some would say, Elijah ascended without dying, but basically, nobody escapes death. You're going to end up in the ground, your body, the food of worms and maggots. And before whom are you destined to give judgment and accounting? Before the King of Kings, the King of the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed is He. Now, before I continue talking about Akavya, I'd like to mention how the Maharal, so Morenu Harav Yehuda Lo, the Maharal of Prague, so a great rabbi, Yehuda Lo of Prague, known as the Maharal, who lived in the 1500s in Prague. And he does this wonderful commentary on Pirkei Avos. I've been studying it with my friend Kurt Byron. I think we started like 6 years ago. I mean, you can go very slowly and very carefully through every Mishna in Pirkei Avos. It's one of those Mishnas that does not have a Gemara. So each teaching, like this one, this is Pirkei Avos 3:1, is a Mishna in itself. And then the Maharal does a commentary on it, right? So the Maharal's commentary is when Akavya ben Mahalalel is teaching us, know where you came from and where you're going, that you came from a putrid drop and you're headed to, dirt, worms, and maggots, but that you will give an accounting of your life before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. What do we learn from this teaching? So the Maharal says this is all about arrogance. It is 100% about arrogance. And what Akavya is giving us is the antidote to arrogance. Why is arrogance so important? Or rather, why is it so important to avoid arrogance? The Mahalalel explains that when we are arrogant, we actually draw the Yetzer Hara to ourselves. What is the Yetzer Hara? It's the evil inclination. But the evil inclination, you can also view it, right, as it's in you. Obviously, it's your own evil inclination. But to help us understand it, you can view it as a destroyer, right? The evil inclination, when you give into it, destroys you. The evil inclination leads you to do drugs and become an alcoholic, to commit adultery, to steal, murder, to all the evil that people do, right? They're first tempted to do it by their own evil inclination. One who is arrogant attracts the evil inclination. The evil inclination loves to do what? To tear down. So one who builds himself up and says, look how great I am, that man, the evil inclination loves that. One who says, I am so great, evil inclination is coming at high speed. One who says, look, maybe I've accomplished a lot. Maybe I've made a lot of money. Maybe I've built buildings. Maybe now I'm a politician and people, love me and vote for me. Maybe I'm a singer and I have very popular songs and, all those things that would make a person arrogant. But if you remind yourself you're a human like any other, you began like every other human as a little drop. You're going to end like every other human in the ground. And like every other human, you're going to have to account for every deed that you commit in this world before God. And the importance of accounting for your deeds before God is that God knows everything you did, everything you thought, right? So when you consider that and really internalize that lesson, it's an antidote to arrogance. You just won't be arrogant, even if you accomplish a lot. Great, beautiful. So you had great opportunities. You worked hard. You did a lot. You accomplished a lot. You became very wealthy. And if you acquired power and you acquired money and you acquired possessions and you acquired followers, okay, so then you have a bigger responsibility to do good with all of those things. You have more responsibility, not less. And therefore, you always have to keep these three teachings in mind: where you came from, where you're going, and before whom you're going to give an accounting, so that you do not become arrogant. Why? Because the evil inclination is drawn to that which is built up, and it avoids that which is broken. It doesn't bother. So when you see yourself as a humble person, right, and the greatest prophet of all time is also referred to as the humblest man of all time, Moses. That's what made him such a great prophet. He remained humble even as he became the greatest prophet of all time. And therefore, he wasn't drawn by his evil inclination. His own evil inclination wasn't attracted to him because he remained so humble. Right? So the Maharal explains what Akavya ben Mahalalel is teaching us with that teaching in Pirkei Avos 3:1. To learn a little bit more about him, at the time of his death, he said to his son, "My son, reverse your opinion regarding the four matters that I used to say contrary to the opinions of the sages." His son said to him, "Well, if that is the correct thing to do, why did you not reverse your opinion?" Akavya replied, "I heard the tradition that I quoted from the mouth of many sages of the previous generation." Right? He heard it directly from his teachers. "And they who disagreed with me also heard contrary traditions that they quoted from the mouths of many sages of the previous generations." In other words, he was in a dispute with his contemporaries because of a dispute that they inherited. He learned one side of it from his teachers. The people who opposed him learned the other side of it from their teachers. And the way it shook out is it was him by himself on one side and all the rest of them on the other side. But the dispute existed in the previous generation. When he received his side of it, he stuck to his guns, even though the other side of that dispute was inherited by everybody else in his generation. His son wanted to honor his father and maintain the point of view on those four matters that he learned from his father. But his father, Akavya, is saying to his son, you heard it from me. You didn't hear it from all the people that I heard it from. You only heard it from me, from one person. That's not enough. You should just go with the majority. And I stood by the teaching, says Akavya, I stood by the teaching I received, and they stood by the teaching they received. But you heard these opposing traditions, one from the mouth of an individual and the other from the mouth of many sages. It is better for you to set aside the words of the individual and hold on to the words of the many. You see the humility that's inherent in Akavya? Akavya's son then said to him, Father, speak with your colleagues to accept me. Akavya's son feared that the sages of that generation might bear a grudge against him due to his father's long-standing dispute with them. They respected him. They just, were angry that he wouldn't change his mind to agree with them. But they respected him. If he would say, listen, my son doesn't hold like I do, you should accept him among yourselves. So he therefore asked his father to request of his colleagues that they accept him. Akavya replied to his son, I will not speak to them on your behalf. His son said to him, have you perhaps found some flaw in me, which is why you're unwilling to speak for me? Akavya said to him, no, far be it from me to find a flaw in you. However, your own deeds will bring you close to the sages, if you are deserving, and your own deeds will distance you from them, if you are not deserving. Right? So he gave his son that opportunity to earn his place among the sages, and he wasn't just going to usher him in just because his father was a revered sage. Some say that Akavya was then placed under ban for his refusal to accept the decision of the majority, and a stone was placed on his coffin when he died. However, Rabbi Yehuda maintains that it is simply inconceivable, if you like Princess Bride, inconceivable that a sage as great as Akavya would have been placed under a ban by the other sages. That is Akavya ben Mahalalel, who is mentioned in today's daf. Let me see, where are we on time? Okay, pretty good. I'm almost at the end. I'm just going to read a couple more selections from the Gemara on this Mishna, and then I'm coming to your questions and comments. So we heard that there's three groups, that they come in three groups. But how big are these groups, right? How many people were were in Jerusalem for Passover, in groups registered on lambs that were slaughtered in the temple and then came out and were roasted and eaten by these people? How many people were in Jerusalem? So the sages taught, once King Agrippa, who is this King Agrippa? Agrippa the first was the grandson of Herod, a descendant of the Hasmonean house through his grandmother Miriam. So the sages taught, once King Agrippa wished to set his eyes on the multitudes of Israel to know how many they were. He said to the high priest, set your eyes on the Paschal lambs. Count how many animals are brought in order to approximate the number of people. The high priest took a kidney from each one, as the kidneys are burned on the altar. So that's one of the sacrificial parts that does not remain with the Paschal offering, which is then taken out and roasted and eaten by the people that night. But the kidneys are offered on the altar. So the priest counted the kidneys, right? He took a kidney from each one as the kidneys are burned on the altar, and 600,000 pairs of kidneys were found there. Double the number, 600,000 pairs, right? So that's double the number of those who left Egypt. We just learned actually in this parsha that 600,000 men left Egypt, and that's why we estimate that there were about 2 million total when the Jews left Egypt. And so it would seem like, and that's just the people who brought the lambs, right? This did not reflect the sum total of the Jewish people. as it excluded those who were ritually impure or at a great distance, right? If you're tameh, if you're in a state of ritual impurity, or you're too far from Jerusalem to get there for Passover, you're excused. You can come for the second Passover, which is a month later. And so those are the people who did not come to offer the sacrifice. Furthermore, this was a count of the Paschal lambs and not of the people. And there was not a single Paschal lamb that did not have more than that did not have more than 10 people registered for it. They called that Passover the Passover of the crowded, due to the large number of people. In other words, there were 6 million people in the environs of Jerusalem. Some might say, is that the real number? Is there a chance that maybe that was inflated? It was exaggerated? That's what it says. That's what the Talmud says. Even if it's speaking in somewhat hyperbolic fashion, you can get the picture that there were hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people who crowded into Jerusalem, and the lambs were slaughtered in the temple, and then they came out and they had, basically like fire pits and campsites all around the city as they celebrated Passover. And finally, the last thing I'll mention here, why was it important? It's important that so many people were there, but we had that image before that the priests would stand in rows to sort of pass the blood of the offering in either, there was a row of them holding golden bowls, and there was another row of them holding silver bowls, and they alternated gold rows, silver rows. And about that, it was also taught in the Mishna that the priest would pass the bowl of blood to another priest. Now, the Gemara suggests, learn from this, that carrying without walking, i.e. transporting the blood to the altar by passing it from hand to hand without actually walking with it to the altar, is considered a valid act of carrying, right? One of the rites is carrying the blood to the altar. So you get the picture in your head of somebody, a priest, holding the vessel with the blood in it and walking to the altar. But the fact that they were passing it down the line, sort of like a bucket brigade, counts as carrying. So the rite was being fulfilled, R-I-T-E. As carrying the blood of the sacrifice, one of the 4 rites involved in the offering of the sacrifice. This would resolve the same unanswered question in Tractate Zevachim. The Gemara rejects this proof. Perhaps the priest would move a little with his feet as he passed the bowl to the next priest in order to fulfill the requirement to walk with the blood. So maybe passing from one to the other isn't how they fulfilled carrying. Maybe they walked a little bit. Each one took a step in the direction of his neighbor. Rather, what does this account of how they transported the blood to the altar teach us? The Gemara answers, it teaches us that the priests were arranged in rows in order to increase the number of people involved in the rite and fulfill the principle from Proverbs 14:28, in the multitude of people is the king's glory. When it comes to religious practice, when it comes to Jewish observance, when it comes to fulfilling mitzvahs, the more people are doing it, the more people are involved, the better. It gives glory to God. So the more people, it's great if you wrap tefillin every day. It's even better if you make sure that other Jews are doing it too. It's great if you light candles every Friday if you're a woman. It's even better if you arrange for even more women to be lighting candles. The more people are doing mitzvahs, the more we glorify the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. All right, let me come to questions and comments. Okay, Lynn says, they did not make an erev to be able to carry the lambs on Sabbath. So that was a good question. It's actually asked here in the notes. When the slaughtering of the animal happened on Shabbos, right? When the afternoon before Passover is Shabbos itself, and they would make certain exceptions. What they could and couldn't do. It would seem they could carry a lamb because there was an erev, right? The whole city was surrounded by a fence that would count as an erev. But there's a note there that, at a certain point, the walls of Jerusalem were breached, and then they did not have a valid erev. But also there was the concern that people might come, if they see carrying going on Shabbos of the Paschal lamb, they might think, oh, well, I guess on Shabbos, all the laws of Shabbos are abrogated because it's Pesach or it's Erev Pesach, and to make sure that people understood that there are some things that override Shabbos, but most things do not. They would avoid having people carrying their lambs in Jerusalem. Nina says that that there was much discussion about animal rights and whether animals have souls, and here are some of the comments. We definitely believe that animals have souls. There is the animal soul, as it were, which is considered like the lowest level of the human soul, but it is the animal soul, right? So an animal is 100%, infinitely different than an inorganic thing. Animals do have souls in the Jewish tradition, but it's the lowest level of soul compared to the human. Only the human can contemplate its creator, its maker, can praise its maker, etc. The animals function on instinct. That doesn't mean that we ever countenance cruelty to animals. There's never unnecessary cruelty to animals, and there are many teachings about that in the Torah. For example, if you see a beast of burden struggling under its burden and it's owned by your enemy, you have to rush over there and help him unload the animal so that the animal doesn't suffer, even though it will be awkward for you to be helping your enemy. That's just one of those teachings. Sharon, when I read this the first time, I was struck by two things: how orderly and collaborative this process was, and how disturbing the mass slaughter must have been. No question. I mean, when you see that many animals slaughtered in one place, I think any of us, if we visited a slaughterhouse today, if we're not accustomed to that, it'd be very, very difficult. But if we eat meat, either we can witness that and understand what goes into it, or we shouldn't eat the meat, right? I mean, just ignoring it because it's uncomfortable, maybe that's a cop-out. It's something that I'm not saying that I visit slaughterhouses all the time or ever, but I really think we need to be, cognizant of what goes into the meat that we eat if we're going to participate in that. Michael says they give up their life, the animals, or their lives taken from them. I kind of do not see this as a matter of consent. Fair enough. They don't consent in the matter. We definitely consider that, they're not capable of consent in the same way that humans are. But it's a valid point, and if somebody feels strongly about that, that may be a reason for them not to eat meat. I'm not saying that people should eat meat. I'm saying if you eat meat, you should be aware of what goes into that process. Meg says, I understand that it was custom to do so, but I don't understand the theological necessity of mass animal sacrifice or sprinkling of blood on the altar. It reminds me of the mass factory farming today. It sounds like the temple is a slaughterhouse. I can't imagine how this would ever be acceptable to a modern day society. Now, this kind of mass slaughter, that would only happen once a year, right? During the rest of the year, there were many sacrifices being brought, but nothing like this kind of scale when everybody had to have the Korban Pesach that night. But to see it all at once, yeah, I mean, very, very difficult. Now, I believe Rambam, Maimonides, says that even when the Messiah comes, perhaps we won't. There'll be a third temple, but perhaps there won't be a return to animal sacrifice. I believe I've read that his opinion was that, the ancients, animal sacrifice was like the way to worship. It was just like, if you were going to worship anything, you would bring an animal as a sacrifice. Literally, to sacrifice that which was most valuable, the animals in your flock. And so when, God revealed himself to the world through his servant Abraham and then the Jewish people, there was this idea that this was almost like an intermediate phase in the history of humankind where, we'd first wean ourselves away from idolatry and polytheism, keeping the sort of nature of worship the same, that sacrifices would be brought, but that eventually, as the world became accustomed to worshiping the one God, that perhaps the animal sacrifice would no longer be necessary. That is the way that history has played out. There have been animal sacrifices, I think anywhere in a long time, certainly not in any kind of general way. So perhaps that's the way it will play out. We don't know. The fact is, there are so many laws in the Torah which do concern animal sacrifice that, we would also not be surprised if somehow sacrifice comes back when the third temple comes. But listen, we don't need to argue about it at all. When the Messiah comes, when the third temple is built, then God will tell us what we should and shouldn't do with his creatures. Right? Steve, I lived for a long time in the country, meaning rural, where we would often kill our own meat. It is nothing like factory farms. The factory farms are soulless. Most states with large factory farming have laws to limit outside cameras and recordings, right? Because it would just be so overwhelmingly awful if we were to witness that. I mean, that's the bottom line. Yeah, this is a tough issue. I'm not saying I have any ready answers for us. I'm not. And finally, Sharon, a dear friend of mine, raised his own animals and had a shochet, a kosher butcher, come to slaughter them. He said he could sense the departure of the spirit. See, I mean, that's beautiful, right? If you're going to eat meat, you got to be in touch with what's really going on there. The fact that there's mass slaughterhouses and how awful it would be to actually witness that. I think we just, we purposely ignore what's going on in the world so that we won't have to think about it, so that we could just eat our meat and enjoy it. What can I say? We have to face up to it. That's what's going on out there. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's something to wrestle with. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. These are some tough issues, but hopefully our takeaway tonight would be to remember a little bit about the Mensch that we met, Akavya ben Mahalalel, and his lesson on how to break the back of our own arrogance, to remember where we came from, where we are going, and before whom we are destined to give an accounting of our deeds in